Well, welcome this afternoon. It's great to see such a good crowd here for our fifth Heerman Lecture of the current year. My name is Ronnie Green. I have the pleasure of serving as the Vice Chancellor of the Institute of Ag and Natural Resources here at UNL. The Heerman Lectures is a relatively new event that we started just this year, where we're focused on food, fuel, natural resource, and rural community sustainability through a lecture series that we bring leading authorities in these areas to our campus to engage in dialogue with us on these topics. The Heerman Lectures is enabled by a recent gift from Keith and Norma Heerman to the University of Nebraska Foundation. And unfortunately, this is the first of the Heerman Lectures that the Heermans have not been able to attend. Norma lost a nephew whose funeral is today, so your thoughts and prayers are with Keith and Norma. But we are seriously indebted to them for enabling us to have this lecture series and to bring people like you'll hear today to our campus. So please recognize them with a round of applause for allowing us this opportunity. We have a number of special guests with us today. I see President Milliken in the back from our university, Susan Fritz from the Provost's office at the university level, Prem Paul, our Vice Chancellor of Research and Economic Development, Lane Carr, Student Regent here from UNL, John Gale, our Secretary of State from the state of Nebraska. We're very pleased to have you with us. The lecture today, like all of these, is being web streamed live for people off of campus and those who couldn't join us here in the room today to be able to participate. It's also being seen on Campus Cable Channel 4 and Lincoln Channel 21. All of these lectures are archived on the web, so if you don't have the opportunity to see them or haven't seen some of the previous lectures, please know you can go there at heermanlectures.unl.edu to watch them. Today is an exciting day for us because we welcome one of our newest faculty members at the University of Nebraska to be the Heerman Lecturer, Dr. Roberto Lenton. Dr. Lenton just recently, as of February the 1st, assumed the founding director role of the Dietary Water for Food Institute that is across our University of Nebraska campuses. We are very pleased. I can tell you there is no one more excited than me to see him show up, maybe other than Prem Paul, to be here as our founding director. We feel very, very fortunate to have attracted him to this position. He comes from serving as chairperson of the Independent World Bank Inspection Panel, where he served as chair since 2009, and he remains a member of that panel until August of this year. He's an internationally recognized expert in water management and development with some 40 years of international experience in water resources and sustainable development. He earned his civil engineering degree from the University of Buenos Aires and his PhD from MIT. Past positions include serving as chairman of the Water Supply and Sanitation Collaborative Council and of the Technical Committee of the Global Water Partnership. He was director of the Sustainable Energy and Environment Divisions of the UN's Development Program in New York and Director General of the International Water Management Institute in Sri Lanka. Under his leadership, the International Water Management Institute grew from a small project-based organization to a major institute with more than 300 people in 10 countries and an annual budget that tripled in size during his tenure. He served as the program officer in the Rural Poverty and Resources Program of the Ford Foundation in New Delhi and in New York. He's co-chaired the United Nations Millennium Project Task Force on Water and Sanitation and was lead author on that task force's final report, as well as much more. Today, we've asked Dr. Lenton to address the topic of water for food, think globally, act locally. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Roberto Lenton.
Well, thank you very much, Ronnie. That was a great introduction, and needless to say, it's absolutely wonderful to be here. So thank you not only for that introduction, Ronnie, but for suggesting that I give this talk this afternoon. It's absolutely an honor on my side to be a part of the Human Lecture Series. It's an important lecture series. There can be really no better opportunity for me to be able to speak as part of this series. And so soon after I got off the plane, I just started my position here in Nebraska a couple of weeks ago, so I'm really very, very fresh, and what could be better than meeting with you, sharing some initial ideas, and getting feedback from you. So it's really a perfect opportunity, and thank you, Ronnie, again for suggesting that. It also works very well from a timing point of view, because just last Thursday we had an outstanding talk from Moens Bai and from Bob Meany, and it was their topic talking about global water issues, not only water and food, but global water challenges. And my sense is that this one, and I'm trying to make it this way, dovetails very nicely with the broad talk that they gave. So you do have an opportunity between last week and this week, those of you who were there last Thursday, to see how these topics interact with each other. So it's a real pleasure to be here. Let me see if I can get this to click, and it does. And as Ronnie emphasized earlier, the topic that I have been asked to speak about is the overall water for food nexus, and I've chosen as an important sort of subtitle the idea of global interconnectedness, the fact that there are common problems, and it's very important to have a global understanding, but that in the end, so many of the problems and solutions are very much context-specific and have to be locally determined. So that's a theme that I hope will run through much of what I say. The outline of the talk is what I want to achieve here can be neatly divided into two parts. One is the big picture, the challenge of water for food that I really feel is one of the key global challenges of the 21st century. There's absolutely no question that this is an issue that's going to be with us, not just now, but throughout this century, and it's not an easy one at all. So I want to talk about why we need more crop per drop, the water for food nexus, but I also want to talk about the local global nexus that is an important dimension from it. And as part of the big picture, I wanted to give some examples, China, India, and Nebraska, in terms of indicators and metrics for water for food. And so that's going to be the first part of my talk. And then in the second part of the talk, I'm going to address the issue of our institute, the Robert B. Doherty Water for Food Institute, and what it is that we have to offer, how do we see ourselves addressing the overall global challenge. So I'm going to talk about what I view as our comparative advantages, talk a little bit about the overall vision and the directions that I see that we're going to be going in, and then finally some initial programs and activities. And I'm going to try to do all that in about 40 minutes so that there is time for discussion at the end. And feedback, which, as I said earlier, is really very important from my perspective. And I hope you will forgive the fact that 10 days after after arriving here is not exactly the time that I'm going to have huge new insights to be able to share with you, but I hope it'll be useful nevertheless. So let me start with a global overview. The best way to look at the problem and to conclude why it is that we need more crop per drop is to look at what is happening on the food demand side and then look at what is happening on the water side. So in green, the trends in population and in global food demand, and in blue, the trends in water availability and use. And we can see that those trends lead to some pretty clear conclusions. Let's start with the food side, and of course we all familiar with global population growth. We all know that we passed the 6 billion mark over a year ago. We're heading towards 9 billion by the year 2050. This is much less than what we feared not too long ago, but nevertheless, it's a significant 50% increase between 2010 and 2050. In addition, and perhaps more importantly, is not that a total addition of 3 billion people, but where will that growth in population happen? And as you can see from this diagram, it's going to happen primarily in Asia and in sub-Saharan Africa, 41% and 49% respectively. Very modest growth in North America, negative growth in Europe, also very modest growth in Latin America, but clearly in Asia and in Africa, that's where the major population growth is going to happen. And this issue is, from a food perspective, has to be viewed not simply in terms of more people eating more food, but really a very positive outcome of rising incomes is in fact increases in actual consumption. So you have greater numbers of people, but in those areas where you have the greatest population growth also is going to be the areas where you're going to have greater food consumption. And so this table shows that between 1964, 66 and the year 2030, it's almost it's something like 40% increase in the dietary energy supply in the calories per person per day. And that is significant, particularly because this refers to developing countries, and it's primarily in the developing countries where you will see that population growth. So that clearly has big impacts for food. But there is one additional subtlety that is important from a water perspective, and that has to do with what is likely to happen in terms of meat consumption. And if you look at OECD countries, there is going to be an increase in meat consumption in total, although a decrease on beef in specifically. But if you look at sub-Saharan Africa and East Asia, you will have fairly dramatic increases in meat consumption. And again, that's a very positive outcome of rising incomes, although that's positive when you're at the lower end, but certainly not very positive when you're at the higher end of the spectrum. But from a water point of view, that has great significance because there is a huge difference between the amount of water that is consumed, for example, for beef production, in comparison, say, with maize or with potatoes. If you just go to one extreme, it takes only 160 liters of water to get a kilo of potatoes, but it takes 15,000, almost 16,000 liters of water to get 1 kilo of beef. And those numbers are really very, very significant. I should also mention, by way of comparison, that in terms of what we as human beings need to survive, the WHO estimates the minimum requirements for our drinking and our health is 50 liters per day per person. So 50 liters per day per person is what we need to survive, and yet for beef production you're talking about 15,000, 16,000 liters of water. So it's an order of magnitude or more different. So that is very important for us to recognize as we look at the relationship between food demand and water requirements over time. Let's look now at land, because land is also a factor. If we need to increase food production, you're obviously going to be thinking, well, what are the opportunities for increasing cropland? And I think, as we all know, those opportunities are limited, particularly in those parts of the world where we're going to have the greatest population increases. Clearly, the arable land per person in North America, in Europe, to some extent in South America, is reasonably comfortable. But when you go to sub-Saharan Africa, to the Middle East, to North Africa, Central America and the Caribbean, and particularly Asia, then the arable land per person is much more limited and much less able to offer opportunities for expanded food production. So in the areas that matter, where we're going to have the greatest increases in food requirements, is the areas where the potential for increasing land is not high. What I wanted to turn to after looking at the food side and then the land side is looking at water. And this is a very interesting diagram that gives an overall balance of how water is used globally. This comes from a very important study that was carried out by the International Water Management Institute and several partner organizations a few years ago, called the Comprehensive Assessment of Water Management in Agriculture. And this water balance starts by distinguishing between green water and blue water being the water that we can actually extract from rivers, from wetlands, from lakes, from the groundwater. And green water is the water that is part of soil moisture from rain, and that is used in rain-fed agriculture and, of course, in landscapes more generally. And if you go to the diagram there at the top, you see the total amounts, 100% in terms of water falling in the way of precipitation. Some 50%, 56% being used as green water for bioenergy, forest products, grazing lands, biodiversity. About 5%, just less than 5%, being used, again, green water being used in rain-fed agriculture for crops, for livestock. And then we come to irrigated agriculture. And irrigated agriculture uses a combination of green water, 0.6%, and 1.4%, the blue water that is either extracted from the ground or from rivers and lakes. And that's used, again, for crops and livestock, but also for aquaculture. And then, of course, you have evaporation from the oceans primarily, and then a fairly small amount used for cities and industries. So this gives you a sense of the relatively small amount that is used in proportion to the total in both rain-fed agriculture and irrigated agriculture, but it also emphasizes how much more water is used, in fact, by rain-fed agriculture than by irrigated agriculture if you take into account both green water and blue water. So that gives you a nice overall picture. And let's look at the amount of water that is withdrawn. If we take as a whole, the extraction of water for different purposes, about 70% globally is extracted for agriculture. I say 70% globally because if you go to developing countries, it's much more closer to 80%, but globally it's 70%. And you'll see how it breaks down in the very green, it's agricultural use. In the very blue, it's industrial use, and in the sort of white and blue in the middle, it's the domestic use. And clearly, in the more industrialized parts of the world, you will see greater amounts being used for industry, certainly in Europe, in North America, in East Asia, and the Pacific. But in other parts of the world, the agricultural use of water is predominant. So as we become more industrialized, the demand for water from industry and particularly from thirsty cities increases. And that's another trend that we have to keep in mind here. And it's a very, very important trend of increasing urbanization. This slide is taken from a World Bank analysis of what's happening in East Asia and the Pacific, and it emphasizes there that 500 million more people will be moving into Asian cities by the year 2025, and the number of cities of over 1 million inhabitants in that region alone will grow to over 100, and I guess it's around 170 by the year 2015. So we're talking about increasing urbanization, and the implications for that, of course, is that as cities grow, as more and more people moving into cities, cities themselves and the industries and people that live in them will constitute an increasing competition for water for agricultural use. Let me just throw one more hurdle into all this on the waterfront, and that has to do with climate variability and change. And we're not living anymore in an era where you can assume that there is a sort of a constant, what hydrologists call stationarity in terms of water availabilities. There seems to be little doubt that there are changing patterns of precipitation and therefore changing patterns of flow in rivers. One thing, though, that one should take into account is that fairly small changes in precipitation can in fact lead to fairly large changes in flows. And this is simply a diagram that I'd like to use that has data on the reduction in precipitation in several countries from the 50s, the decade of the 50s and 60s to the decade of the 70s and the 80s. And in the decade of the 70s and 80s, there was quite a sharp reduction in precipitation. Well, the important thing here is on the right-hand column, you see the reduction in flows. And they were significantly greater than the reduction in precipitation. And so one should keep that in mind, is that when one is talking about climate change, climate variability, those impacts can get magnified when we talk about flows, and therefore the amounts of water available in terms of green water for irrigated, in terms of blue water for irrigated agriculture. And these impacts can be very significant. Oh, shoot. There we are. These impacts can be very significant for agricultural growth. We have an example here from Ethiopia. This was also a World Bank study in 2006, where there was an analysis of the impact of rainfall variability in over 2 decades. and fairly clear, you have, as in those years where rainfall was good, you had positive GDP growth and positive agricultural GDP growth. In those years that rainfall was limited, you had the opposite effect. The important thing to recognize is that in some of these most vulnerable countries, you really have this very, very sharp correlation between agricultural growth and overall GDP, economic growth, and rainfall. You would hardly ever see this kind of one-to-one correlation in those in industrialized countries that have generally invested heavily in infrastructure that allows countries to overcome and be less vulnerable to these changes. So the important point that I want to get across here is climate variability, climate change is significant from a water point of view. We're going to be seeing the impacts particularly on water regimes. So how does all this add up? If you look at the trends on the left-hand side and on the right-hand side, clearly they all go in one direction, making the case for more crop per drop fairly clear. On the food side, we have increased global consumption, not only because of population growth, but because of rising incomes and changing diets. We know there are limited opportunities for expansion in cropland. And a couple of other points that I didn't emphasize earlier is that we do have limits as a result of land degradation and competition from non-food crops, from biofuels. So clearly on the food side we have one direction, and on the water side we have clearly increased competition by other water users, principally cities. We have increased variability in time and space, and I should have mentioned earlier increased recognition of environmental water needs. The environment needs water and needs to be recognized as a legitimate water user. That, I guess, is where I would conclude in terms of the water for food overview. Let me say just a few things about the global and local nexus. Let me start with the issue of water scarcity, because that's where one sees perhaps the greatest differences from one place to another. And this is a very useful map that was also prepared by the Comprehensive Assessment of Water Management in Agriculture. It denotes in the sort of light red areas of physical water scarcity. And water scarcity is defined in terms of how much of the demand is met, and the demand can be for different purposes. And we define it as physical water scarcity when, in fact, more than 75% of the river flows are already being withdrawn for different purposes. So we're approaching the point where you would start interfering with the needs of water for the environment. In the lighter pink, we have areas that are approaching physical water scarcity, where we have 60% of, or more than 60% of river flows are withdrawn, and they will probably be moving towards areas of physical water scarcity in the future. Perhaps the most significant issue in the developing world is areas that aren't necessarily water scarce from a physical point of view. That is to say, the water being withdrawn isn't approaching serious limits in terms of the water that is available, but we have human, we have institutional, we have financial limits that don't allow access to water in the amount that is required. And as you can see from this figure, large amounts of sub-Saharan Africa, some parts of Western Latin America, and some parts of South and Southeast Asia would come into the areas of economic water scarcity. And then there's the rest of the world where there's little or no water scarcity, but still very significant issues of water management. And we say little or no water scarcity when we have abundant water resources relative to use. So I think this is important to emphasize from 2 points of view. One is that it's scarcity is relative. It's how we are in terms of availabilities relative to the demands, and secondly, that there are huge differences in water scarcity in different parts of the world, either from an economic point of view or from a physical point of view, and that there must be a way. There we are. That I guess emphasizes what I was trying to emphasize in the title of my talk, is that although we can talk about a global challenge of water for food, and we see pressures moving inexorably in one direction when we look at things globally, in the end, the situation in any particular point is very, very specific. And not only the situations are very specific, not only the availabilities and the requirements depend on local conditions, but very often the technologies and the policy options that we might be able to come up with are also context specific. They're constrained by the local environment, by local political systems, by local governance systems. And that emphasizes the need to be able to have a broad perspective, to be able to think globally, but at the same time to act locally. So let me, let me talk a little bit about metrics and indicators, because one of the issues that is pretty pervasive in the water and food area when you're trying to look at that nexus is a real sort of paucity in terms of hard information, hard metrics, and hard indicators. And I think one of the challenges for the Water for Food Institute is to be able to provide data and analysis where that is lacking. Just to illustrate this, the United Nations every 3 years brings out a World Water Development Report. For the last 3 or 4 issues, they have wanted to have a chapter on indicators. And every single time they have failed because coming to grips with indicators, coming up with indicators that are useful to policymakers and for which there are real data is a very difficult job, a very difficult challenge. And I think there is a need to give a lot of attention to this issue. Let me just try to illustrate what I'm talking about with a few examples, which also illustrate the fact that how countries are doing vis-a-vis water and food is really quite different. And this is an interesting set of diagrams prepared by my colleague Uma Lede at the World Bank. She did this for the Global Water Partnership. It's a diagram looking at the amount of area equipped for irrigation around the world and how it changed from 1961 in the upper left-hand corner to 1990 in the upper right to 2009 at the bottom. And one can really get lost in all this data, but if you look at India and China, you will see that, that India significantly increased its area irrigated in that period, whereas China, in fact, in absolute terms, it stayed about the same, but in relative terms, it actually decreased. So we had a situation where 2 countries started out more or less the same, and then over the last 40, 50 years, one country took a very irrigation-intensive course, heavy investment in irrigation, that was India, whereas China took a different course. They, in fact, didn't have the opportunity to expand irrigation the way that India did. The interesting thing is what happened to total cereal production, because China and India also started out about the same in terms of total cereal production. But if you look at where we are in 2009, China is almost double where India is. And so here we had two countries, one clearly investing in irrigation, clearly increasing its use of water, another that didn't. And yet the country that didn't must have done something really good in terms of crop per drop, because they outpaced India in terms of total cereal production. This is a very simplified story, but I think it does illustrate the difference in trajectories between different countries. I tried to come up with similar data for Nebraska, and some of you have probably seen these diagrams. They were provided to me by Rachel Herpel from Jim Specht. And they also try to look at what has happened with irrigated and rain-fed acreages in Nebraska over the last 40 years. And you see an increase, particularly in irrigated agriculture in the early period in the 70s, more or less constant after that time, and significant increases in both rain-fed and irrigated yields. And that's the kind of information, these trajectories of states and countries around the world, that I think we've got to come with better grip on, so that we can say, well, these countries or these areas are clearly doing well in terms of crop per drop. What are the lessons? What is it that drove those results? Let me now go to the second part of the talk, which is given this global challenge on water for food, and given really the varying conditions around the world, what is it that we at the Water for Food Institute can offer? What are the comparative advantages? And I thought a lot about this. In fact, at the time that I was discussing this position with the university, it was very, very important for me to be convinced that what was happening here in Nebraska was a real opportunity, and something that not just another water institute, but the potential to be the water institute addressing this issue of water for food. And I base this conclusion on what I saw as several real clear comparative advantages, things that we could offer here from Nebraska. First of all, of course, is Nebraska's track record in water resources management. Nebraska is a state where it's absolutely fascinating to come here, because everybody's interested in water, everybody wants to talk about water. The lecture last Thursday night was attended by maybe 600, 700 people. You couldn't get 600 or 700 people in New York or Washington to talk about water. That just simply wouldn't happen. Here it does. And that's really important. And it's also not only an issue where there is a track record of leadership, but also where you have diversity, where you have major river systems with opportunities for surface water irrigation for the Platte River, the Loup, the Republican, but also the High Plains Aquifer, not only the largest in North America, but very significant globally, and with decades of data that one can draw on. So that's one clear comparative advantage. If you're going to have an institute focused on water, you'd better have it in a place where water is vital, and where there is local experience that you can draw, and that gives you credibility. Second, it's a unique natural laboratory, and what you do want to have if you're going to locate an institute is you want to be able to carry out action research in live irrigation systems. And in Nebraska, not only do you have that, but you have clearly different agroecological zones. So in a very short geographical, very small, relatively small geographical area, you have 4 major agroecological zones. You have big differences in rainfall as you go from east to west, and you also have big differences in elevation. So you have a unique natural laboratory, very, very diverse. You have in the University of Nebraska, the base of this institute, a land grant university. And for me, the land grant system is particularly important because of the connection between research and practice and policy. And it's a university with a long track record of engagement in water and food issues, not only in Nebraska, but globally. We're trying to get an inventory of all the faculty and research staff that are working on water and food issues at Nebraska University. And it's a long, long list. And it's very diverse. It crosses the 4 campuses. It crosses the different departments. And it includes a variety of subject areas. These are just a few that are listed here: groundwater, drought prediction and mitigation, irrigation efficiency, plant genomics, agroecology, food science, information technology, remote sensing, water agricultural economics, policy and law, and the human dimensions of water use. So we go from the physical to the social sciences, physical, biological, social sciences, covering a large number of aspects of water for food. So it's a wonderful base on which to work on. We're not starting by any means from scratch. And we also have, and this struck me as being very important when I was interviewing for the position, you have the convening power of the university that has been brought home by the Water for Food conferences. From 2009, 2010, 2011, and the next one this June on blue water, green water, and the future of agriculture. They brought home to me the convening power of the university, and in fact many colleagues that I knew in the water world knew about this institute because they had either come to the Water for Food conferences or had heard about it. So it's a very important calling card of this university and the institute. So there's a lot to build on, and my sense of where we should be going is looking for ways to capitalize on those comparative advantages. The institute, as you all know, was established in 2010 with a very generous $50 million gift from the Robert B. Dougherty Charitable Foundation. The vision, as articulated in the early documents, is that of a research, education, and policy institute committed to helping the world efficiently use its limited freshwater resources, with particular focus on ensuring the food supply for current and future generations. Its work, I think, is nicely characterized by this diagram that I'm sure was developed in the early stages, but I think it brings together the different aspects of the work of the Institute in a nice way. It emphasizes that the programs are integrated, interdisciplinary, international, the 3 I's, but they also, if you go from the innermost circle to outermost circle in that drop, it encompasses research, education, outreach, and policy analysis, and it involves partnerships with the University of Nebraska, with the academic partners, with industry partners, and with public sector partners. So that really crystallizes things very nicely. Let me just outline 4 or 5 areas that I think would characterize this institute over time, and where one of our tasks early on is to prepare a strategic plan, and we'll be capturing this in our strategic plan. But one of the important things is because we have experience here in Nebraska of rain-fed as well as irrigated agriculture and how to improve water management in both, it's very important, I think, for this institute to focus on the full agricultural water management spectrum, from rain-fed to irrigated. And this diagram, also from the comprehensive assessment, I think captures that spectrum very, very well. Right from the left, you have purely rain-fed, where you're focusing on field conservation practices. Right on the right, you have fully irrigated from groundwater or from surface water. But it also emphasizes the importance of supplemental irrigation, water harvesting, and drainage, and also the importance of looking both at green and blue water. And that, I think, should be the hallmark of the Institute, again capitalizing on the experience that we have here. The second is that there should be a focus on innovation and connecting research with practice and policy. And again, that's to capture the advantage of being based at a land-grant university. You really want to have that philosophy imbued all the way through. We're talking about innovation that is technological, and when we mean technology, we mean not only irrigation technology, but information technology. That's really important to capture in this day and age, and that might in fact be the greatest revolution in technology. It might come on the information technology side and not necessarily at this stage on the irrigation technology side. Secondly, not limiting ourselves to just looking at the technological side, at the technical side, but the need for institutional and policy innovation. And again, always seeking impact, a culture of impact measurement, and that means connecting the research with the practice and the policy. A third, going back to what I was saying earlier, finding a way to connect local and global water and food issues, recognizing that they are inherently context-specific, but looking there for ways in which we have an integrated program carried out in different geographical locations, but with common frameworks so that we can compare and analyze the results in one country or another. I envisage that we would have programs here in Nebraska, many carried out through the Nebraska Water Center, but also in 4 or 5 key countries. I would hope that we could have activities and partnerships in India, in China, in Brazil, in countries where we would be able to, within a common framework, analyze more context-specific issues. And then finally, and perhaps most importantly, really drawing on all the resources of the university. Across the 4 campuses, all departments and programs, graduate and undergraduate, involving and interacting with visiting fellows from outside and visiting scholars. I was, for many years before coming here, part of the Earth Institute at Columbia University, and the Earth Institute at Columbia University was philosophically viewed as an institute embracing everything that was going on at Columbia that had to do with sustainable development. And it had an enormous impact because of that sort of university-wide vision. And that's the vision that I think we should have here at the Water for Food Institute. It's not simply those of us directly engaged in the center, but the larger community of people across the university, hopefully including many in this room. Let me talk briefly about some initial programs and activities. We have had the good fortune of not only starting the Institute, but even before the Institute, even before I arrived, having seed grants underway. We had last year, I believe it was, 7 initial seed grants approved, a couple that were global in nature, and several that were more Nebraska specific. This is a list of them. And let me just spend a couple of minutes on one specific example. and many of those involved in this program are here in this room. This was developed by our colleague Ken Kasman. It's a global crop yield gap and water productivity atlas. And for me, this is important because it shows how we can have a global framework, but that has context-specific relevance. And it's based on a very simple concept of trying to map across the world, trying to understand what is the yield potential, what is and the yield potential, of course, depends very, very much on specific conditions and temperature and so on and so forth. Attainable yield, which is what percentage of that potential, technical potential can be attained. Let's assume that it's 75 to 85%, and comparing that with average farm yields. And if you map that across the world, you'll get a good sense of where you can, by proper investment in better water management and other approaches, go from the average farm yield at least to attainable yield. And you can figure out where it makes sense to invest, for example, in irrigation and where not. And what is defined as the exploitable yield gap. And the ambition here, the vision and goal, is within 4 years to have a global yield gap atlas that would be widely available. And that is essentially a specific protocol to estimate crop yield gaps at field, regional, and national scales. Again, the excitement for me and for my colleagues of this is that it is evidence-based, it's real data, it's useful for policymakers, and it gives you a global framework, but it provides information that can be used at very specific local scales. And needless to say, it's something that integrates the research that is carried out here in Nebraska, with the research that might be carried out in China or Ethiopia or India or wherever. We have lots of partnerships underway. We have been working for a specific memorandum of understanding with the USAID agreements. So this all happened before I arrived. I'm happily not taking any credit for this whatsoever. Delft University in the Netherlands, discussions underway with the University of Sao Paulo in Brazil, in India with Jain Irrigation and the MS Swaminathan Research Foundation. There are explorations that are about to begin in China and with Harvard and MIT. Lots of really exciting partnerships already being explored. Just this last Thursday, a group of us, and I think you'll recognize a few of the people in the photograph, went over to the US Agency for International Development and signed a memorandum of understanding for work in the Middle East and North Africa. And this is very significant because the US Agency for International Development does not have these kinds of memorandum of understanding with many academic institutions. We're one of the very few, and I think it's a recognition that there is something that we have that the US Agency for International Development would like to partner with. Physically, we're in the Whittier Research Building. I have my office there, it's great. And our next step is to be part of the Nebraska Innovation Campus when that takes off. So clearly we're well established, even though I'm only 10 days into the job. But one of the things, and this is my concluding slide, is that we really have a huge task ahead of us to turn the vision into reality. We have a huge amount to build on. As I said earlier, I'm excited that we have so many comparative advantages, but to turn those comparative advantages to a really important program and to turn that vision into reality just requires a lot of action on many different fronts. We have a challenge on the institutional development front in terms of programs, in terms of people. We've got hiring that we have to do in terms of putting systems in place, in terms of resources, because we certainly want to leverage the very generous $50 million grant from the Dietary Foundation. And as I said earlier, we need to develop a strategic plan. We have a huge task ahead of us in terms of partnerships and stakeholder engagement, because we have, in some ways, three concentric circles of stakeholders. We have, at one level, stakeholders within the university, and we've got to reach out within the university. We have an important group of stakeholders within the state of Nebraska, and we have an important set of stakeholders at the global level and the global community, and trying to develop effective partnerships at those three levels, keeping those very different sets of stakeholders happy and engaged with the Institute is going to be a hugely important task. And to help us in that, we have a whole set of rollout events, both locally and globally. I spoke a couple of weeks ago at the Nebraska Farm Bureau meeting here in Lincoln. I anticipate there'll be many more, but not only here locally in Nebraska at the university, but also globally it's going to be significant. We have a meeting in Marseille, the World Water Forum, that we'll be attending next month, and in August we'll be at the Stockholm Water Week. So clearly this is not an easy task, and we have our plates full, but with the support of the university, the commitment from the highest levels of the university, and the enthusiasm and interest that I have experienced from everyone that I have met since arriving here, I have absolutely no doubt that this can be achieved. So again, thank you very much for your attention. Thank you, Ronnie, for inviting me, and I'm more than happy to get some feedback. Thank you.
We'll do a few questions from the floor.
There we go.
I think we have a couple of roving mics that will be on the floor. Jill will have one down on the floor, and we have one up top on the balcony as well. So if we do have some time for some questions and feedback to Roberto's lecture. So are there questions that we have from participants in the floor? Yes, up top.
Yes, Roberto, you've talked at length about blue water and green water, and you've put it in the context of water quantity. Could you say a few words about what you see the Institute's role in dealing with brown water and gray water and the effluent that comes from intensive agriculture, salinization, sediment, pesticides, and so forth?
Should we take a couple or?
Why don't you just go on by one?
Well, thanks for that question. I do want to emphasize that the sort of the holistic agenda, and clearly water quality is as much a part of the issue of scarcity as water quantity. When we're talking about scarcity, we have to think of it in terms of the water that is available for the use to which it is put. And so therefore, when we're talking about water for agricultural use and water for domestic use and so on, you've got to consider the quality as well as the quantity. So if I emphasize the water quantity issues, it wasn't in any way diminishing the importance of water quality. I do think it's very important in agricultural as well as in other uses of water to look at the full cycle and to look at the in a sense the other side of the water cycle. Very often one looks at the front end without looking at the back end. And that's why I was emphasizing in that diagram of rain-fed to irrigated, the drainage aspects. So you've got to really look not only at the capture of water for agriculture, but at the disposal side of it. And that also goes incidentally for other aspects of water use. So thank you for raising that point, and it's an important issue to emphasize when we get to our strategic plan.
Other questions from the floor? Yes, Mark.
First of all, Dr. Lenton, welcome to Nebraska. I hope you find it a very welcoming place to be. The question I have, and it's beyond just water for food, but in one of the previous water for food conferences, there was a discussion about the relative importance of management, that we have a lot of the technical skills, but we need more work in the area of water management. But one of the issues that impacts a lot of water, including agriculture water, are watersheds that cross political boundaries, whether they're states or countries. Do you see the Water for Food Institute playing a role in addressing that issue? And if so, how and who would be some of the partnering institutions that we would be involved with?
Thank you again, and thank you for the welcome to Nebraska. I do feel very welcome here. I think you have identified just one of the important realities of water management is that watersheds are very useful tools in terms of being able to look at water supply side availabilities, but decisions are often not made on a watershed basis. And so they certainly do cross political boundaries, whether they are boundaries between one county and another within a state, or whether there are boundaries between states within a country, or whether they are boundaries between one country and another. And you do have these issues of water management just crossing those political boundaries. That's simply a reality that we have to deal with. So there is, I think it's, the Institute can't escape from those realities. It's part of the issue of water management that we're dealing with, and coming up with sensible political, institutional ways of dealing with these issues is part of our brief.
Is this on? Thank you for coming and doing this talk. It was interesting to listen to. I have a question as a farmer. One of the things I noticed kind of going through the slides here is, as we talk about crop per drop, I see some real similarities to some of the same issues we're having in the agricultural field, where we focus so much solely on yield at this point that we're starting to now realize that we've gained a lot of that yield due to reliance on fossil fuels and resources that are not renewable. What is the Institute doing to kind of, I guess I'm hoping there's some focus on something other than just strictly yield, or, when we're talking about technology and things like that, is there also some crossover to, more sustainable agricultural processes and ways to encourage that?
Again, thank you very much for raising that issue, because certainly when we're talking about crop per drop, we're talking about sustainable increases in crop per drop. And it just has to be part of the overall philosophy that we're not here looking for short-term gains, but really gains that can be realized sustainably. And that requires looking after the natural resource base. So certainly the lens, the angle that I come at these issues are a lens of sustainability, and that means looking after natural resources, whether it's the aquifer or whether it's the soil, the other resources that we have to make sure that we care for in an appropriate way. So thanks for emphasizing that.
Dr. Lenton, you had as the last on your list of focuses for the Institute, human factors, I think, or human dimension. Could you say a little bit more detail about how you see the Institute getting into the human dimension of more crop per drop?
Where I come at this is that increasingly over the last couple of decades, I've seen much less of a separation between the technical and the human, the social considerations. That there's much more of a willingness, recognition that if we're going to solve problems of water management, whether it be water management for agriculture or more broadly, you've got to deal with the technical, the social, the economic in an integrated way. So for me, it's an absolutely central part of the agenda. The challenge is to put together teams of people that are really multidisciplinary. What I have found is that the best ingredient for success is not only to have people from different disciplines working together, but having each person from each discipline, in fact, taking on some of the characteristics of other disciplines, so that you have physical scientists talking like social scientists and vice versa, that you don't have, in fact, simply people coming together of different disciplines, but you have a real interdisciplinary mindset when you're looking at these questions. So I have found that even though I was trained in engineering, I spend as much of my time working and thinking about social and institutional issues and economic issues, for that matter, than the strictly engineering and technical. And I think that's more what I see in more and more of my colleagues, and I hope that's that's a philosophy that we can have here.
Let's take a couple more questions.
Yes. Dr. Lenton, you so aptly showed a slide of how extreme amount of water it takes to produce beef and pork and so forth, and I happen to be a cattle producer in this state, and I guess I'm wondering where this really fits then as we look at feeding the world with more protein. The prediction, more red meat will be, or do I need to go to raising potatoes?
Well, it's all very context specific, isn't it? And I think the point that I was trying to emphasize is that as people who have been at the lower end of the income scale and the lower end of the nutritional intake are naturally going to want to be moving up the ladder, as it were. And so it's simply a fact of life. And that there's going to be greater demand for meat products. There isn't any sort of moral judgment there. It's simply that's a fact of life, and it's a positive reflection of rising incomes and large numbers of people escaping poverty. That's simply where we are. I think at the same time, there are trends, and I think important trends, in industrialized countries at the other end of the nutritional scale, where you will see changes in diet. I think a greater attention to the water footprint, I think, would be healthy. But I do, in terms of the total numbers, the most important trend here is simply people getting out of poverty and using some of that additional income to be able to have a better nutrition for themselves and their families.
Okay, one more, Jill.
I was very interested in the discussion of water for food. In Nebraska, we have a very unique situation with our natural resource districts in monitoring water use development for commercial growth. Could that concept be developed on a global scale that local entities could have an impact on water use for food production?
I didn't capture the beginning part of your statement.
Well, our natural resource district in Nebraska regulate the number of wells to be drilled, the number of water to be pumped, and there's very informative in helping us to water use.
Yeah.
And that has been a model that I thought could be developed on a worldly scale.
Yep. No, thanks for clarifying that, because in fact that is one of the things that I think I was referring to when I said that Nebraska has a lot to offer in terms of its track record of engagement and leadership in water resource management, and it's the natural resource districts that captures that. In other countries that I'm familiar with, you do have watershed associations, but generally their powers are much, much weaker. And the amount of data that they have and information and ability to be able to influence what is done is much, much weaker than it would be here. So that is, for me, a model of what can be done and something that is useful to build on in looking at institutional and policy options in other countries. It's exactly that I was referring to. Thank you.
Okay, would you please join me in thanking Roberto for a wonderful lecture. Now, please, before you take off, we have a couple of other things we want to do. First of all, you'll see on the screen the medal that we have commissioned now that each of our lecturers will receive for delivering one of the Heuermann lectures. So we're very pleased, Roberto, to present you with a Heuermann Lecture medal so you can remember this event and remember coming to Nebraska to join us as the founding director of the Dietary Water for Food Institute. Thank you.
Thank you, Leonard. Thank you. Thank you.
And I would ask you to please place these two dates on your calendar. We have one remaining Heuermann Lecture for this current academic year. That lecture will happen on May the 8th. At 2:30 in the afternoon, so it'll be a 2 o'clock reception, 2:30 lecture here in this room. The lecturer will be Dr. Jay Kiesling from the University of California, Berkeley. Dr. Kiesling is a Nebraska native, a UNL alum, as an undergraduate here in Arts and Sciences, and is the director of the Joint Bioenergy Institute at UC Berkeley. So we're very pleased to have him coming to talk to us on the bold future of alternative energy, will be Jay's topic. And then on September the 28th will be our first Heuermann Lecture for the next school year. It will be an evening event on Friday of that week. That is also homecoming week for the UNL community. This will be a panel of 4 former secretaries of agriculture, Clayton Yoder, Mike Johans, Dan Glickman, and Ann Veneman. So those 4 former secretaries will be talking to us about the future of the land-grant mission and where they see the future of that happening, given that this is the 150th anniversary year of the Land-Grant Act. So please place those on your calendars, save those dates, and we'll look forward to seeing you at those lectures. Thank you for being here.